it's a pretty complicated business because urban poverty is itself a new phenomenon. While rural poverty, the world has known, and Asian countries have known rural poverty for a very, very long time. Urban poverty is a relatively new phenomenon. That is one reason why we do not find a consistent definition across countries. But one thing which is common, the countries that define poverty, urban poverty, one thing is common, that it is measured in terms of some kind of a nutritional intake. That if you have X number of calories and the money equivalent of that calories, people having that calories would be considered to be above poverty line, and not countries or people not having that nutritional intake would be considered to be below the poverty line. The World Bank also uses the same, this $1.25 poverty line with which we are all familiar, is the one that the World Bank derived by looking at the poverty definitions of 15 countries across the world before they come up with $1 poverty. China, for instance, does not have the kind of definition that countries like India has, 2,100 calories plus some component of non-food expenditure that would define the poverty line. China does not have that kind of a definition. Cambodia does not distinguish between rural and urban poverty at all. So you will find very, very large variations. In some of the countries such as Pakistan, you will find the nutritional intake is pretty high, like 2,750 calories per capita per day. And below that, they consider everyone to be poor. So you find these definition differences, and that is one reason why we do not come across good papers written on urban poverty, for instance, across Asian countries and so on and so forth. So it's a pretty complicated business. And we are talking only of income or consumption poverty here, not the other variants of poverty which have come into being over the past 10, 15 years or so. And that really, I think we're asking an important question, that how do you distinguish by rural and urban? Urban is getting to be much more complex. It is not just income or consumption deficits that we're talking about here. We're talking of livelihood deficits where there are working poverty that you earn, but you don't earn enough to be able to live well. Or you have shelter poverty. That is what slums are all about. And right now, 1/3 of urban population around the world is considered to be living in slums. In China itself, roughly about 22% of the world's slum population live in China. In India, about 13-14% of people, the world's people, the population which live in slums. So very, very high proportion of people living in slums, which is the visible poverty. Rising inequalities, another form of poverty that we find in countries such as India, Philippines, and so on and so forth. You also have another kind of poverty deficit, which is in terms of services, water supply not being available, sanitation not being available. These are huge, huge concerns in urban areas because these have negative externalities. In the rural areas, that component is not as important as it happens to be in the urban areas. So therefore, the urban poverty is much more complex, it is multifaceted, and to be able to deal with urban poverty, you really require a multidisciplinary kind of an approach that can take into account not only income, but shelter deprivations, the livelihood deficits, service deficits, infrastructure deficits, rising inequalities. That is what makes it complex. The real issue is, and here I would give the Indian example, whether investment in places like slums are a win-win for the slum dwellers as well as for those who are investing in it. What we have found in India is that if you take two slums, for instance, one which is improved and upgraded, and the second one which is not improved and not upgraded, there are huge productivity differentials between the two. So there is an economic rationale emerges from the fact that there are differences in productivity. In the improvement does bring in productivity. And the moment you have that, you have willy-nilly brought in the private sector into the game. And that is the argument that we are now using and beginning to sort of bring in the private sector, telling them that you have an economic interest in it. If you invest in them, it is the economy that really gains, and through the economic gains that the economy is getting it, the private sector wins it. We are also giving some indirect benefits to indirect channels to the private sector. For example, if we invest in slums, we will give an equivalent of the FAR, which is floor area ratio, in order to compensate for any investment that you're making there. So what you invest here, you can recover through the increased FAR, either in the same area or in some other area.
The FAR
is the floor area index, that is the height of the building. If slums are like 2 floors or 3 floors, you allow them to construct 5 floors, and the balance of the 2 floors, you can sell it to anyone else, while the 3 floors will go back to the slum residents. You give them the incentive of constructing 2 more additional floors. The moment we begin to think in terms of the fact that the slums also have a role in economic and social development, our perceptions with respect to slums and what they can do will begin to change. And that is the kind of shift that civil society and people themselves can bring. I was giving them the example of the largest slum in Asia, which is Dharavi in Mumbai. Dharavi alone produces exports, leather goods, including, you're not wearing jeans, but Wranglers and Levi's, worth about $2 billion every year from that slum alone. As soon as you go there, you will find there are subcontracting and franchises in the slum itself. And that is the kind of, I was telling him also that there are coffee table books now in slums. There is slum tourism, which is so it is not something that what we used to do in 50s and the 60s, the slum clearance is the option. But it is the slum improvement and upgrading and giving them the basic rights and giving them basic services and enabling them to enter into the labor market and the land market to be able to give them the access. I think that is something that all of us need to aim at, including, I believe, the Asian Development Bank. I would think so, rather than trying to figure out how we can get rid of them.